Hey guys, rotation is just around the corner, and I thought now is a good time to look at what rotation is going to take away from us and what we can use to replace those gaps that we're going to get in our decks. Let's look at what rotation actually is and how can we supplement the cards from what we currently have to fix the gaps left by things like Radiant Greninja, Rotom V, or even tool cards like Lost Vacuum. Obviously there will never be a one like for like replacement, but we can try and find something or a new playstyle to try and work out how we can get to how we used to be playing. And maybe even find a new way. Let's get into it, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Radiant cards. Radiant cards have been a mix of ridiculously useful to very niche, depending on road deck. For the most common ones, here are some suggestions, and maybe some cards we can use as a workaround. So, first up we have Radiant Greninja. This card is insanely useful. Like, it is in all sorts of decks, from Gardevoir to Raging Bolt, to random road decks that just need to get stuff thrown away, to the new Cerule Edge that needs to get energy into the discard. It's a really great card. You burn one energy, get two cards. It's straightforward as that. And in decks like the Palkia, which use Palkia V-Star, it could get accelerated energy accelerated to it, and it could be used to basically take out things like Mimikyu or low HP bench Pokemon very quickly and efficiently. It was a single prizer, and like all Radiant cards, only allowed one in the deck. As a suggestion, you could use the new Ends Aurora coming out, or possibly Iono's Wheel Watch Rule, both of which discard a card to draw cards. The downside to that is that you need to evolve these new cards, and they are a 2-prize liability sitting in your deck versus Radiant Greninja's 1. But, you know, it could be worse. If you need that draw support, it's going to be there in some form. Next up, we have Radiant Charizard. This one has been sitting in various decks for a while, most obviously the Charizard EX deck. It's a useful card. Basically, as your opponent takes prizes, its energy cost is reduced, so that in the end, if you're on the back foot, you can be using Radiant Charizard to burn with just 1 or maybe 2 energy and still hit for 250, taking out a grass type for 500, or any Pokemon that are getting in your way to try and level the playing field a little bit. Again, it's a single prizer. There are very limited replacement options, but my obvious suggestion, which I think a few people have already started doing, is using Blood Moon Ursaluna. It works in a similar way that if the opponent's taken prizes, energy cost is reduced. The downside to this is Blood Moon Ursaluna is a 2-prize card. So rather than the 1 prizer that was the Radiant Charizard, you're now risking 2 prizes. But it hits pretty hard. Downside is it has got quite high retreat cost, and if it's one in your deck and it's the first and only basic you pull, that could be your opening hand, which can make life tricky. Next up, we have my favourite, Radiant Alakazam. I love this card. Like, I use it in my Dragon Ball decks, I've used it in other damage spread decks just to move damage around and keep my opponent on their toes. Plus, its attack only costs like 2 energy, and it does 20 or 30 for every single card in your opponent's hand, which can ramp up very quickly. And in effect, it's a great way to get out of trouble. An obvious replacement for this, probably the best, is going to be the Munkidori with the Dark Energy. The downside to that is it has to be your damage moving over to your opponent. If you have no damage, you can't move anything around, which sucks, but you know, there are worse things in life. Plus, Munkidori does 30 versus the Alakazam's 20. Now, this list isn't going to be exhaustive, so I'm just going to touch quickly on Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, which I know is used in a lot of donk decks, because it adds extra poison damage to poison Pokemon. So your opponent's active will get an extra 2 damage for being poisoned. Honestly, I can't think of much that replaces this one. Maybe the promo Petulant, but you're probably already using that at the same time. So I don't know how that will work out, and could be a bad time for Cloth decks. So we shall see. Next up, let's look at support Pokemon. I'm not going to do a big exhaustive list on this one, because we could be here forever. Most obvious support Pokemon that are disappearing are Manaphy, which blocks damage onto your bench from attacks, not from damage counters. So things like the Hydreigon's Obsidian, that'd be blocked. Koreum's attack, that'd be blocked. Dragapult, no, that's not blocked, because Dragapult is putting 60 damage, not an attack. The obvious replacement here is probably going to be something like the Rabska line. The downside to that is you're going to have to evolve it from up. So it's a stage one, so it's not the worst in the world, but it is sitting there and you have to evolve it before you can start stopping that damage. And if it's in your prizes, you're stuck. Another one that I think a lot of people are going to be missing, I'm going to miss in some of my decks, is the Bidoof Bibarel line, where you can draw cards until you have X amount, I think it's 5, 6 in your hand. That's a sad loss. It's a great draw engine with industrial incisors, but again, like with the Radiant Greninja earlier, I reckon you could probably get away with using something like Iono's Kilowattrel if you don't mind the fact that you've got to evolve it. You have to evolve Bidoof into Bibarel anyway, so not so bad. The downside and negatives to that are Kilowattrel is a 2-prize liability sitting on your bench. Next up, let's look at support Vs. Now these are the big chunky ones that sit, the tech that sits at the back of your bench filling up spaces you don't really use for attacking. They have been incredibly useful. Like, I built so many decks that I'm like, this needs some draw support, so I'm going to use Rotom V. Its ability basically meant that you could draw 3 cards and end your turn. If you had a whiff of a whiff hand, like, why not? So let's look at some of these and how we can replace them. First up is obviously Rotom V. Love this card so much. It is a card draw. So if you use its ability, you instant charge, you basically end your turn but draw 3 cards. The obvious replacement here would be something like Cleffa, which is essentially an attack, so you can't use it going first. But you can draw cards until you have 7 in your hand, and then your turn ends. There's also the possibility of using the Dunsparce, which if you evolve Dunsparce into Dunsparce, you can then bury it back into your deck and draw 3, or potentially there's a way of using Revavroom. The downside and negatives of this are that they are all quite squishy. Like, Cleffa has 30 HP, so you're probably going to be able to do that once unless your opponent is particularly bad, and you're essentially giving away a prize. Which can work in some decks, it doesn't work in others. Next up, Lumineon V. This one, if you play it from your hand to the bench, not straight to the bench with Nestball, you can play its ability to search for a supporter. This can be particularly useful if you are sitting there trying to evolve and you have no Arvens and you need your Rare Candy or you need a TM Devo, anything like that. It's a great way to get them into your hand to be able to play them. I think the most obvious way of doing that at the moment would be with Noctowl, but there are complicated steps to that you have to have a Terra Pokemon on the bench and play the Hoo-Hoo ready to evolve into the Noctowl, to then use Dual Seeking to be able to search for 2 trainer cards. The obvious negative there is that once it's done its thing, it's kind of sitting there, so you're going to want to churro it up, which already puts you at the Hoot-Hoot, the Noctowl, the Terra Pokemon, just to be able to play it, and potentially a Churro to bring it back up again, which is 4 cards just to be able to search for a supporter or trainer card. Make your own mind up on that. A lot of people pair it with Area Zero Underdepths to give that extra board space, and then, yeah, it's not just a big deal, but your playtime will vary. Next one, Oranguru V. I've seen this used in a lot of donk decks. Basically, once it's in the active, you may search for 2 tools to attach to Pokemon. That's kind of it, really. It's used in, like I say, in a lot of donk decks for things like Bravery Charm or the Binding Mochi and things like that, just to be able to get those tools in so you can start playing and moving stuff around on your board. I think probably the closest card we have to that now will be the Stadium Town Store, where once per turn you may search for a tool card. Kind of works similar, but slower, obviously. I haven't personally tested it, I can't tell you. Next up would be Pidgeot V. This card is used in a lot of stall and wall decks because its ability means it goes back into the deck, and essentially you can't really deck out because you've got your Pidgeot V, send it back, draw it out, send it back. I personally don't have it, so I can't tell you how that works, but it does exist. From memory, I'd say probably the closest to that would be the Squover, where you put it back into your deck and you can draw a card. I'm not sure if that'll work for the long term, but we shall see. The other obvious one would be the Dunsparce, but here we are. And lastly, I want to give a special mention, not technically a Pokemon V, but it has a V-style move, and that's Forest Sealstone. I think a lot of us are going to miss Forest Sealstone basically being able to draw anything we like out of the deck. Was a V-star power, and it was usually chained up with things like Rare Candy and the whole Rare Candy, Pidgeot, Charizard, Rare Candy, Pidgeot, Dragapult, them sort of decks. Because you could basically just draw out what you needed and fire away, and you'd be up and running in like turn 2. So I think we're all going to seriously miss Forested. Next up, let's look at trainers, tools, and stadiums. Post-rotation, we're using a lot of stable tools that we've all got very used to using and very, very comfortable with, but there are a few possible replacements. So let's look into it and we'll work our way through. First up, Lost Vacuum. This basically, for the cost of another card that you'll put into the Lost Zone, you can remove a stadium or tool for your opponent's Pokemon, or your own, like it's up to you, and basically send it to the Lost Zone so it can't be brought back and they don't have that power. Most obvious and kind of, I guess, the closest to this one would be using Jamming Tower, which basically stops all Pokemon tools from being used on the build. Which, you know, that works. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. The downside to that is being a stadium, it can get bumped by someone else's. A lot of stadiums are getting used right now. Next up, we have Cancelling Cologne. This basically stops abilities till the end of your turn. So if your opponent is playing Iron Thorns and you need to use an ability to be able to start moving, you can play Cancelling Cologne and you can stop their ability from working so you can get stuff done. This is also useful for things like Pidgeot, where it wouldn't be able to do its quick search, or Teal Mask Ogerpon not being able to use Teal Dance. I forgot what it was called. It's one and only reason. I think the obvious ones to replace these sort of things with are Clefclee and Fluttermane. The negatives to that are they are very, very squishy. So your opponent's not going to have a hard time being able to take them out. Maybe they do, who knows. Next up, Trekking Shoes. Kind of a big one for the Raging Bolt players. Basically, you play Trekking Shoes, you look at the top card of your deck, you can choose to keep it or discard it. If you discard it, you can draw the next card and you keep that. It's a great way of getting through and trying to find cards that you need, and occasionally discarding energy, which you can then solder back out again. I think it would be most missed by, like, say, Raging Bolt, but there's a few other decks that have used it and found use for it. Personally, I can't think of anything that replaces it. But that's the fun of rotation, we just got to figure out the new puzzle. Next up, Lance. I'm a big Dragapult player. I've never actually put Lance in my deck, but I know some people have, especially since the Dew came out, and you've kind of need to find those cards. It's a great way of being able to get your Dracloaks and Dragapult out onto the bench fast. There isn't an obvious one to play here, but the new Brock card coming out is kind of similar, so that may be able to work in our favour. Although I think that is a 2 basics or a basic or an evolved, something like that. But let's look, we'll find out. Onto some stadiums now. Magna Basin. This one's quite popular with a lot of people with fire decks, or those that need damage, such as Growlithe EX. This basically takes a fire energy from your discard and puts onto your Pokemon, inflicting 20 damage. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything at the moment, but let's see what the future holds, especially with Heatwave Arena and Team Rocket around the corner. Then we have Collapse Stadium. This one's kind of like the anti Area 0, and rather than turning your bench to 8 Pokemon wide, squishes it down to 4. This is a great way to get rid of surplus tech cards that you don't need anymore, like your Lumineon, or any liabilities that are sitting on the bench that haven't got a use anymore. Again, like Lumineon, your Noctowls, things like that that aren't going to be attacking, but are sitting there and could cause problems. Off the top of my head, we don't have an actual stadium that will do that anymore, but we can run things like Penny and Churro to get a similar effect of removing those liabilities away. The downside to that is you're going to be using your supporter card when you could be using something more important, such as Crispin or Arven. Lastly, because this is not an exhaustive list, I think we should all say goodbye to Pokestop. I'm saying good riddance. I can't stand the card. Every time I've ever played it, it has always kicked me in the arse. But it has its uses, such as getting things into this card very quickly, and sometimes it's coming clutch to just find that one item that completely changes your game. So yeah, that's been a run through of some of the changes coming up. Let's look later and see if we can find any more, and good luck with your games. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.